There's a particular kind of silence that follows a knock you weren't expecting. Not the comfortable quiet of an empty house, but something sharper. Something that makes your hands pause over whatever meaningless task they were performing. I was arranging dried lavender into bundles when I heard it. 3 precise raps against my front door at 9:15 on a Tuesday morning. The code enforcement officer was younger than I expected. Fresh-faced, apologetic before he even opened his mouth. He held a clipboard like a shield between us. "Mrs. Castellano? I'm here regarding a complaint about an unlicensed business operating from this address." I didn't invite him in. I simply stepped aside and let the doorway speak for itself. The modest foyer, the basket of dried flowers on the hall table, the faint scent of rosemary and eucalyptus that had become as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. "A complaint," I repeated, not a question. I already knew. I'd lived on Wisteria Lane for 11 years, raised my daughter here after the divorce, built something small and beautiful from the wreckage of a marriage that had promised me everything and delivered nothing but lessons in how to survive on less. My business, if you could call it that, had started the way most meaningful things do. Accidentally, out of necessity, with trembling hands and no backup plan. Handmade soaps, botanical bath products, dried flower arrangements. Nothing that would make anyone rich, but enough to keep the lights on while I figured out who I was without a husband's name attached to mine. I sold at the farmer's market on Saturdays, took custom orders through a simple website my daughter Mia had built for me during her junior year of high school. Occasionally, a customer would stop by to pick up an order, never more than 2 or 3 times a week, always by appointment, always quiet. The complaint alleges excessive commercial traffic, unpermitted signage, and operation of a retail business in a residential zone. The officer read from his clipboard without meeting my eyes. "I'll need to inspect the premises and document any violations." I let him look, watched him photograph my small workshop in the converted garage, the drying racks, the soap molds, the essential oils arranged in alphabetical order on their wooden shelves. He counted the inventory like he was cataloging evidence of some great crime. "Ma'am, you do appear to be operating without a home occupation permit." "I applied for one 3 years ago," I said quietly. "It was denied." He blinked, checked his notes, found nothing about that particular detail. "The denial letter cited insufficient parking and proximity to neighbors," I continued. I appealed. The appeal was also denied. I was told to cease operations immediately. "And did you?" I looked at him, really looked, until he shifted his weight from one foot to the other like a child caught in a lie he didn't tell. I stopped taking appointments, stopped advertising locally. I sell at markets now, ship orders from the post office. The only traffic this address sees is the same traffic every other house on this street sees. Delivery trucks, friends, family. He wrote something on his clipboard. I couldn't see what. "I'm required to issue a warning," he said finally. "If another complaint is filed within 90 days, there will be fines, potentially a cease and desist order." After he left, I stood in my kitchen and watched through the window as his car pulled away. And then I watched as the curtains in the house directly across the street fluttered closed. Diane Mercer. Of course, I'd known Diane for the entire 11 years I'd lived on Wisteria Lane, which is to say I didn't know her at all. She was the kind of woman who collected information about her neighbors the way some people collect stamps, methodically, joylessly, with an attention to detail that bordered on obsession. She knew everyone's schedules, when they left for work, when their teenagers snuck out at night, which marriages were struggling, which were already dead, which were being held together by nothing but spite and shared mortgages. She'd never liked me. I understood this in the abstract way you understand that some people simply won't, no matter what you do. But I'd never given her a reason to act on that dislike. I kept my lawn mowed. My trash cans came in on schedule. I smiled and waved when our paths crossed. Accepted her comments about my little hobby with the same grace I'd learned to accept every other dismissal in my life. What I didn't understand, what I couldn't have known then, was that Diane's dislike had nothing to do with me at all. The second complaint came 3 weeks later. This time, the officer wasn't alone. He brought a supervisor, a woman with silver hair and tired eyes who introduced herself as Patricia Holcomb from the City Planning Department. "Mrs. Castellano, we've received multiple complaints now, noise violations, parking violations, reports of chemical odors emanating from your property." Chemical odors, I almost laughed. "I make soap with olive oil and lavender. The complaints describe industrial-strength fumes causing respiratory distress. I opened my garage door and let them smell for themselves. rosemary, chamomile. The faint sweetness of honey from the beeswax candles cooling on their racks. Patricia Holcomb's expression shifted, not quite to sympathy, but somewhere adjacent. She walked the perimeter of my property, made notes, asked questions about drainage and ventilation that suggested she was looking for something specific and not finding it. Off the record, she said finally, her voice low enough that her colleague couldn't hear, I'd recommend you document everything, every interaction, every complaint, every response. Get a lawyer if you can afford one. Am I in trouble? She didn't answer directly. Someone wants you to be. I'd built my life on the principle that keeping your head down was the same as keeping yourself safe, that if you didn't make waves, the current couldn't pull you under. My mother had taught me that. My ex-husband had reinforced it every time he'd punished me for having an opinion, a feeling, a desire that didn't align with his. It took me years to unlearn the idea that smallness was protection, that invisibility was a form of safety, that the quiet women of the world could escape notice simply by not making noise. But some people notice silence, some people hunt for it. I started watching Diane the way she'd been watching me, not with binoculars or security cameras, nothing so dramatic. I simply paid attention, noticed the pattern of her movements, the FedEx truck that stopped at her house 3 times a week, the parade of strangers who knocked on her door and left carrying small packages, the late-night visits from the same silver SUV that always parked 2 houses down, never directly in front. I noticed the foreclosure sign too, the one that appeared in her yard on a Wednesday morning, stuck into the grass like a flag claiming territory for some invisible enemy. That surprised me. Diane drove a Mercedes, wore designer clothing, spoke constantly about her investments, her vacation properties, her financial advisor who apparently hung the moon and stars on her personal command. But there it was. The bright red sign that meant everything she'd built, or pretended to build, was crumbling beneath her. I'm not proud of what I felt in that moment. Not the rush of satisfaction that spread through my chest like warm water. Not the way my hands steadied for the first time in weeks, but I won't pretend I didn't feel it. Mom, you need to tell me what's going on. Mia had driven up from the city for the weekend, a surprise visit that wasn't a surprise at all. She'd heard something in my voice during our last phone call, some frequency of stress that only daughters can detect. I told her everything, the complaints, the inspections, the veiled threats wrapped in legal language. The woman across the street who had decided, for reasons I still couldn't name, that I needed to be destroyed. Have you talked to her? Asked her why? What would I say? Excuse me, Diane, but why are you trying to ruin my life? She'd deny it. Probably file a harassment complaint on top of everything else. Mia was quiet for a long moment. She had her father's eyes, dark and assessing, but she'd inherited my patience, my willingness to sit with a problem until it revealed its own solution. There has to be a reason, she said finally. People don't just wake up one day and decide to target someone. Something triggered this. I thought about that for the rest of the weekend. Replayed every interaction I could remember. The time Diane's dog had gotten loose, and I'd walked it back to her door. The neighborhood association meeting where I'd voted against her proposal to ban front yard vegetable gardens. The afternoon, her husband had helped me carry groceries inside when I'd been struggling with a sprained ankle. Her husband, Marcus Mercer, quiet, kind, perpetually overshadowed by his wife's aggressive social climbing. He'd stopped by a few times after that afternoon, once to check on my ankle, once to bring me homemade soup when I'd mentioned feeling under the weather. Small kindnesses from a man who seemed starved for the opportunity to be kind. The visits had stopped abruptly about 6 months ago. Around the same time, Diane's surveillance had intensified. I didn't let myself follow that thread too far. Not then. It felt dangerous, like pulling at a loose stitch in a garment you couldn't afford to replace. But my hands remembered the shape of it, filed it away for later. The foreclosure auction was scheduled for a Friday at 2 p.m. I found out from Patricia Holcomb, who called me under the pretense of following up on a permit application. I thought you should know, she said, her voice careful and neutral. The property at 847 Wisteria Lane is being auctioned next week. Opening bid is significantly below market value. Why are you telling me this? Because I've worked in this department for 23 years, Mrs. Castellano. I've seen what happens when someone with power decides to use the system as a weapon, and I've seen what happens when good people don't fight back. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in my garden, the one Diane had complained about, citing excessive growth and potential pest attraction. And I did something I hadn't allowed myself to do in years. I calculated the life insurance policy from my grandmother's estate. the emergency fund I'd built penny by penny over the past decade. The small inheritance my mother had left me, sitting untouched in an account I'd sworn never to access unless I was truly desperate. It wasn't enough to buy a house outright, but it might be enough to place a bid, to enter a game I'd never expected to play. I called my daughter at midnight. "Mom, is everything okay?" "I'm going to do something," I said. "Something that might seem crazy. I need you to tell me if I've lost my mind." I told her my plan, waited through the long silence that followed. "Mom," Mia said finally, her voice strange and wondering, "I think you might be the most terrifying person I know." The auction house was cold, utilitarian, stripped of any romance. Folding chairs arranged in rows, like pews, in a church where no one believed in anything anymore. I recognized a few faces, investors mostly, the kind of people who made their living picking at the carcasses of other people's failures. And there, in the back row, was Marcus Mercer. He looked worse than I remembered, thinner, older in ways that had nothing to do with time. His suit didn't fit anymore, hanging from his shoulders like it belonged to someone else, someone he used to be. I sat down beside him. Neither of us spoke. The auctioneer began his patter, lot numbers, and legal descriptions, the bureaucratic poetry of dispossession. When Diane's house came up, I watched Marcus's hands clench in his lap. "Starting bid is $287,000. Do I hear $287,000? A paddle went up in the front row, then another, then three more. I waited, counted bids like heartbeats, watched the price climb steadily toward a ceiling I'd calculated down to the last dollar. $312,000. Do I hear $315,000? I raised my paddle. The room shifted. Not dramatically, nothing so obvious, but I felt it. The subtle recalibration as people noticed me for the first time. The middle-aged woman in the sensible cardigan, bidding on a property that should have been far beyond her reach. $315,000 to the woman in row 6. Do I hear $320,000? Another paddle. A man in the front row with silver cufflinks and the bored expression of someone for whom money was simply a way of keeping score. I raised again. $325,000. The bidding continued. I kept pace, my voice steady, my face carefully blank. Inside, my heart was a trapped bird, throwing itself against the walls of my chest. $342,000. Going once, going twice. I raised my paddle. $350,000. Silence. The investors recalculated. Decided, apparently, that whatever game I was playing wasn't worth the cost of admission. $350,000. Going once, going twice. Sold to the woman in row 6. I didn't look at Marcus, not yet. But I felt him turn toward me, felt the question forming on his lips. "Why?" "Because I can," I said. And it was the first true thing I'd said in months. The paperwork took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of signatures and inspections and title searches. 3 weeks during which Diane Mercer's life continued to disintegrate, in ways I observed with clinical detachment. The Mercedes disappeared first. Then the designer wardrobe, sold piece by piece on consignment sites I'd learned to monitor. Then Marcus himself, moving into an apartment on the other side of town, filing for divorce with a quiet determination that suggested he'd been planning his escape for years. The day the sale finalized, I walked across the street and knocked on my own property's door. Diane answered like she'd been expecting me, like she'd been waiting for this moment since the day she'd filed that first complaint, knowing on some level that it would end here, with her standing in a house that no longer belonged to her, facing the woman she'd tried so hard to destroy. "You," she said. Just that word, loaded with 11 years of accumulated grievance. "You have 30 days to vacate," I replied. "Standard terms. I've already had the paperwork drawn up." "You can't do this." "I already have." She laughed then, a bitter sound, more bark than humor. "You think you've won something. You think this makes you powerful. You're just a woman who makes soap in her garage." "Yes," I agreed. "I am, and now I'm also a woman who owns your house." I turned to leave, made it halfway down the walk before her voice stopped me. "He was mine, Marcus. He was always mine, and you smiled at him, touched his arm, made him feel like he was worth something." I looked back at her, really looked, saw for the first time the architecture of her fear, the way her entire identity had been built on possessing things, status, property, people, because she had never learned how to simply be. "I never touched your husband," I said quietly. "I was kind to him because kindness costs nothing and cruelty costs everything. You might want to think about that, Diane. You have 30 days. The house sat empty for 6 months after she left. I wasn't sure what to do with it. Wasn't sure what I'd intended when I'd raised that paddle in the auction house, beyond the simple satisfaction of being able to. Mia suggested I rent it out. My accountant suggested I flip it. My lawyer suggested I donate it to charity for the tax benefits. In the end, I converted it into something else entirely. The first floor became a community workspace, tables and chairs and high-speed internet, for the growing number of people in our neighborhood who worked from home but craved company. The second floor became affordable rental units, priced below market rate for single mothers and recently divorced women starting over with nothing but their determination. I kept the garden, expanded it actually into a shared growing space where anyone on the street could plant vegetables, flowers, herbs. The excessive growth that Diane had complained about became a feature, not a flaw. The code enforcement officer stopped by once, about a year after the auction, the same young man who'd knocked on my door that first Tuesday morning. I wanted to see it for myself, he said, looking at what the property had become. When I heard what you'd done with it, I thought it must be some kind of mistake. No mistake. He was quiet for a moment. You know, I've done this job for 5 years. I've seen a lot of complaints. Most of them are legitimate, noise violations, safety hazards, that kind of thing. But some of them, he trailed off, shook his head. Some of them are just people using the system to hurt other people. Yes. I'm sorry I was part of that. I should have seen it sooner. You were doing your job, I said. The system worked the way it was designed to work. The problem isn't you. The problem is the design. He nodded slowly, processing that. For what it's worth, I put in a recommendation to change the complaint process. Require evidence before investigations. Make it harder for one person to weaponize the code against another. And, still working on it, these things take time. I thought about time. About the decade I'd spent building something small and beautiful, only to have it threatened by someone who couldn't stand to see me succeed. About the weeks I'd spent watching, calculating, waiting for the moment to act. Time, I repeated? Yes, they do. I ran into Marcus once, about 2 years after everything happened. He was working at a bookshop downtown, looking healthier than I'd ever seen him. More present in his own body. We had coffee. He told me about his life now, the small apartment that was entirely his, the morning walks he'd started taking, the therapy he'd finally begun. I should have left years ago, he said, but I kept thinking, I don't know, that I owed her something, that I'd made a commitment and had to honor it, even when honoring it was killing me. I understand that, I said, better than you know. She blamed you, you know, for everything. She convinced herself that we were having an affair, that I was going to leave her for you, that you were trying to steal her life. We never, I know, she knew too on some level. But it was easier to believe in a villain than to accept that her husband was simply unhappy, that she'd built her entire marriage on control instead of connection. We sat with that for a while. The coffee grew cold between us. What you did, Marcus said finally. Buying the house, I never thanked you for that. You don't have to. No, I do. Because I know why you did it. Not to punish her, though she certainly felt punished. You did it to prove something, to yourself mostly, that you could play the game on your terms, that you weren't powerless. I considered denying it, offering some prettier explanation about community investment and paying forward kindness. But Marcus had earned honesty from me, if nothing else. I spent 20 years being told I was too much and not enough simultaneously, I said. Too loud, too quiet, too ambitious, too lazy. I shrunk myself down until I almost disappeared entirely. When your wife tried to take even that, even the small, quiet life I'd managed to build, something in me finally broke free. And now? Now I know that silence was never surrender. It was strategy. I was waiting all that time, learning, gathering strength for a fight I didn't know was coming. Marcus smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from him in all the years I'd known him. Diane used to say that about you, actually, that you were dangerous because you were patient. She never understood that patience isn't the opposite of action. It's the preparation for it. The community workspace celebrated its 2nd anniversary last month. We had a party in the garden, fairy lights strung through the trees, tables laden with potluck contributions, children running through the vegetable rows, with the particular joy that children bring to spaces they've been told they belong to. Mia came up from the city with her partner, a woman named Sarah who designs sustainable buildings, and looks at my daughter like she hung the moon and stars. They're talking about moving back maybe, finding a place nearby, starting a family. The thought of that, of grandchildren playing in the garden that Diane once tried to weaponize against me, fills me with something I can only describe as peace. I still make soap. Still sell at the farmer's market on Saturdays. Still take custom orders through the website that's been redesigned twice now, each iteration more beautiful than the last. But the business has grown into something I never expected. The converted workspace houses 3 other small batch crafters now, a candle maker, a ceramicist, a woman who does the most extraordinary work with stained glass. We share equipment and advice and the particular camaraderie of people who've chosen to build something meaningful rather than something merely profitable. The home occupation permit was finally approved last year. Different administration, different attitude, different understanding of what it means to support small businesses in residential neighborhoods. I framed the approval letter and hung it in my workshop. Not as a trophy exactly, more as a reminder. People ask me sometimes if I regret what I did. The confrontation, the purchase, the transformation of Diane's home into something that serves the community she tried to isolate me from. I tell them the truth. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that a woman felt so threatened by my existence that she tried to erase me from the neighborhood we shared. I regret that the systems designed to protect us can so easily be twisted into weapons. I regret that kindness is so often mistaken for weakness and patience for passivity. But I don't regret fighting back. I don't regret proving, to myself, to Diane, to everyone who'd ever told me to be smaller, quieter, less, that I was capable of more than survival. I was capable of victory, not the kind of victory that requires someone else's destruction. I take no pleasure in knowing that Diane is still struggling, still trying to rebuild a life that was always more facade than foundation, but the kind of victory that comes from refusing to be diminished, from standing in the full light of your own power and letting people see you as you actually are. I think about something my mother told me once, near the end of her life. She'd been a quiet woman, too. A woman who'd learned to survive by disappearing. The thing about being invisible, she said, is that you see everything. You learn the patterns, the weaknesses, the moments when the people who think they're in control are actually most vulnerable. I didn't understand what she meant then. Thought it was just the rambling of a woman whose mind was loosening its grip on the present, but now I know she was giving me a map. A blueprint for the kind of resistance that doesn't announce itself, that waits and watches and acts only when the moment is perfectly, precisely right. The last time I saw Diane, she was loading boxes into a rental car outside an apartment building across town. I'd driven by purely by chance, a wrong turn on the way to a client meeting, and there she was, smaller than I remembered, wearing clothes that wouldn't have passed her standards 2 years ago. I could have kept driving. Probably should have. Instead, I pulled over, watched her struggle with a particularly heavy box, made a decision. Need help? She froze. Turned slowly, her face cycling through emotions I didn't have time to catalog. Settled finally on something like exhausted resignation. Come to gloat? No, I approached, lifted one end of the box. I came to help. We worked in silence for 10 minutes, loading her car with the remnants of her downsized life. When it was done, we stood there on the sidewalk. 2 women who'd been enemies without ever really understanding why. I'm moving to Arizona, she said finally. My sister's there. She says I can stay until I figure things out. That sounds nice. A fresh start. Yeah, she laughed. But it wasn't bitter this time, just tired. I was so sure I had everything figured out. The house, the status, the position in the neighborhood. I thought if I could just control everything, I'd finally feel, I don't know, safe. Did it work? You know it didn't. She looked at me then, really looked, maybe for the first time ever. I spent years trying to protect something that was already gone. My marriage, my self-respect, my sense of who I was supposed to be. And when I saw you, building something real, something people actually wanted, I couldn't stand it. I couldn't stand that you'd figured out what I never could. I didn't figure out anything, I said. I just stopped letting fear make my decisions for me. She was quiet for a long moment. I'm not going to apologize. I'm not there yet. Maybe I'll never be. I'm not asking you to. But I want you to know, I see it now. What you built, what I tried to destroy. It's good. It's really good. I nodded, accepted the closest thing to accountability she was capable of offering. Take care of yourself, Diane. Yeah. She climbed into her car, then paused with the door open. For what it's worth, Marcus was right about you being patient, being dangerous. I should have seen it as something to learn from, not something to fear. She drove away. I stood on the sidewalk until her car disappeared around the corner, then turned and walked back to my own vehicle. There's a particular kind of silence that follows the end of a long battle. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something deeper, a settling, a recognition that what's done is done, and what remains is simply the living of your life. I drive home through streets I've known for over a decade, past houses I've watched weather seasons and scandals and the ordinary erosion of time. My neighborhood looks the same as it always has. Tidy lawns, sensible cars, curtains that twitch when something unexpected happens. But I'm different. I drive differently, sit differently in my own body, take up space with a comfort I never allowed myself before. The woman I was when I first moved to Wisteria Lane, the one who kept her head down and her voice soft, and her dreams small enough to fit in a converted garage. I think about her sometimes, wonder what she'd make of the woman I've become. I think she'd be proud and a little surprised. And maybe, if she was honest with herself, she'd admit that she'd known all along she was capable of this. She just hadn't been given a reason to prove it yet. I'm in my workshop when Mia calls, her voice bright with news she can barely contain. "We found a house," she says. 3 blocks from you. We're putting in an offer tomorrow." 3 blocks, I repeat. That's close. "Is that okay? I know we talked about it, but I don't want you to feel like we're hovering or—" "Mia," I cut her off gently. "I would love nothing more than to have you 3 blocks away." She exhales, relieved. And I can hear Sarah in the background asking questions, making plans, building the future they've decided to share. After we hang up, I stand at my window and look out at the street, at the garden that grows wilder and more beautiful every year, at the house across the street where women with no money and no options are finding their footing, one day at a time. I think about revenge, about what it means and what it costs, and whether the woman I've become would make the same choices if I had to do it all again. The answer is yes, without hesitation, not because I wanted to hurt Diane, though I'd be lying if I said her pain gave me no satisfaction, but because sometimes the only way forward is through. Sometimes the only way to reclaim yourself is to prove, in terms the world can't ignore, that you were always worth more than they gave you credit for. I didn't ruin Diane Mercer's life. I just stopped letting her ruin mine. And then, because I had the resources and the will and the particular kind of patience that comes from years of being underestimated, I turned her house into something better than she ever made it. That's not revenge, really. That's just what happens when you refuse to be small. The evening light slants through my window, turning the dried lavender gold. I breathe in the scent of rosemary and eucalyptus, the familiar perfume of the life I've built with my own 2 hands. Outside, the garden grows, the community gathers. The women across the street are starting over, just like I did, with nothing but their determination and the space I've made for them. And I'm here, still standing, still making soap in my garage, still patient, still watching, still waiting for whatever comes next. Because that's the thing about being underestimated. It's not a disadvantage, it's a head start. It's a head start.